This is how winners think. Inner steel, full script, 8000 words. Most people think winners are born different. They're not. They think different. And that one shift, how a mind is trained to process the world, changes everything. Right now, somewhere on this planet, two people are staring at the exact same obstacle. One of them sees a wall. The other sees a door. The difference between them isn't talent. It isn't luck. It isn't even discipline. It's the architecture of their mind, the invisible patterns that filter reality before a single decision is made. This is inner steel. And today, we're going inside the skull of the people history remembers. The ones who stood where you're standing, broke, unknown, afraid, outmatched, and found a way through. Not because they were stronger. Because they were wired differently. Stay with this until the end. Because the last story we tell may be the one that stays with you longest. The first thing winners understand: reality is not the enemy. There is a man most people have never heard of, and that is exactly why his story matters. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis. Born in Budapest in 1818, he became a physician in Vienna at a time when the greatest hospitals in Europe were also, quietly, death traps. Women admitted to maternity wards were dying at rates that stunned even the doctors who worked there. 1 in 10. Sometimes 1 in 6. Childbed fever, they called it, and everyone assumed it was something in the air, something in fate, something they couldn't control. Semmelweis controlled it. In 1847, after careful observation, he noticed something that should have been obvious but wasn't. Doctors were walking directly from performing autopsies, handling cadavers with bare hands, to delivering babies. No washing. No pause. Nothing. He proposed a radical idea: wash your hands with a chlorinated lime solution before touching patients. The death rate on his ward plummeted. From 10% to 1%. From 1% to less than 0.2% in some months. He had cracked one of the deadliest puzzles in medicine. And the medical establishment rejected him completely. They mocked him. They dismissed his data. The chief physicians of Vienna called his theory insulting. It implied that they were killing their patients. Semmelweis lost his position. He was eventually committed to a mental asylum, where he died in 1865, beaten by guards in a cruelty almost too precise to be believed, an infection that spread through a wound on his hand. The world vindicated him 20 years later when Pasteur confirmed germ theory. Now, why are we opening with this story? Because Semmelweis made a mistake that almost every person under pressure makes. He found the truth, and then went to war with the people who refused to accept it. He expected reality to bend to evidence. He expected people to respond to data the way physics responds to gravity. Automatically. Inevitably. That is not how the world works. Winners understand this. They don't mistake the map for the territory. They don't believe the world should operate a certain way and then break themselves against it when it doesn't. They see reality with absolute clarity, not the reality they wish existed, not the reality that would be fair, but the reality that is. Semmelweis was right about the science and wrong about the strategy. He had the answer, but he delivered it in a way that made powerful people feel accused rather than enlightened. He couldn't separate what was true from how it would land. The Stoics had a word for this, a more fatty love of fate. Not passive acceptance. Not giving up. Love. The active embrace of what is real so you can work with reality rather than against it. When you see your life as it is, your finances, your relationships, your reputation, your starting point, without flinching and without fantasy, you gain access to the most powerful resource available to a human being: accurate information. You know where you actually are. And from a known position, you can navigate anywhere. The person who lies to themselves about where they stand cannot navigate. They are steering by a broken compass. Winners look at the truth the way a surgeon looks at a wound, not with disgust, not with despair, but with the calm that comes from knowing, I can work with this. The second thing winners understand: pressure is a resource. In the winter of 1914, Ernest Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, became locked in the sea ice of the Weddell Sea, Antarctica. It would never sail again. 27 men. No radio contact. No rescue coming. Temperatures dropping to -30 degrees Celsius. The nearest inhabited land was over 1,000 miles of open ocean away, and not open ocean, the Drake Passage, the most violent stretch of water on Earth. For 10 months, they drifted with the ice. When the Endurance finally sank beneath them, they had 3 small lifeboats, and the clothes on their backs. Here is what Shackleton did. Not what he said, what he did. He made sure every man could see him being steady. He rotated the most anxious crew members into his own tent at night so he could monitor them directly. He kept the cook fed and warm because he understood that the smell of hot food was the difference between a crew that held together and a crew that fractured. He played cards with the men. He sang with them. He instituted a strict schedule of activity because he knew that idle minds in extreme conditions drift toward despair. And then, in one of the most extraordinary feats of seamanship in history, he and 5 men sailed an open lifeboat, 22 feet long, 800 miles through the Drake Passage to South Georgia Island, navigated by a single sextant, in hurricane-force winds, in total darkness half the time. Every single one of his 27 men survived. What Shackleton understood, what separates the leaders and achievers from the average, is that pressure is not a threat to performance. In the hands of a trained mind, pressure is fuel. The average person, when they feel the walls closing in, when the stakes rise and the margin for error shrinks, they begin to contract. The breathing shortens. The thinking narrows. They move away from the thing they fear instead of moving toward the solution. They become smaller precisely when the moment demands they become larger. Winners train themselves to run the opposite pattern. Shackleton did not pretend the situation wasn't dire. He knew exactly how dire it was, perhaps better than anyone. But he had built a mental framework where high stakes meant sharpen, not panic. Where the presence of danger became a cue to slow down internally even as external action accelerated. This is not a personality trait. It is a trained response. Action accelerated. This is not a personality trait. It is a trained response. The way you train it is the same way Shackleton trained it, through repeated exposure to difficulty, through deliberately choosing hard things in low-stakes environments so that when high-stakes moments arrive, the nervous system has a reference point. It has been here before. It knows the way out. You do not find out what you are made of when things are easy. Comfort reveals nothing. It is friction that shows you the grain of the wood. Every hard thing you do not run from is a deposit. And when the moment arrives, and it always arrives, you draw on every deposit you ever made. Shackleton had made 1,000 deposits. That is why when the Endurance went under, the man standing on the ice was not afraid. He was ready. The third thing winners understand, obsession is a superpower when it's directed. In 1944, a 17-year-old boy in North Carolina fell in love with the saxophone. His name was John Coltrane. He was not a prodigy in the conventional sense. He didn't explode onto the scene at 14, didn't have a natural genius that everyone immediately recognized. What he had was something more dangerous. He couldn't stop thinking about music. He practiced until his lips bled. He practiced between sets. He practiced after gigs when other musicians had gone to sleep. Miles Davis, who hired him in 1955, once told Coltrane to take the saxophone out of his mouth between solos because the audience could hear him breathing through it, still practicing in his head while other musicians played. In 1960, Coltrane recorded Giant Steps, an album that broke so many rules of jazz harmony that other musicians, professional musicians who had spent decades in the craft, could barely play along with it. He had invented new harmonic movements, what musicians now call Coltrane changes, that restructured the entire language of jazz. He did it by being obsessed in a particular way. Not obsessed with being famous. Not obsessed with being respected. Obsessed with the problem. With the question. With finding something that had not yet been found. This is the quality that distinguishes great achievers from ambitious ones. Ambition wants the outcome. Obsession wants the work itself. Ambition checks the scoreboard. Obsession doesn't notice there's a scoreboard because it's too busy playing. Most people who fail at big things fail not because they lack talent or even effort. They fail because their effort is powered by a source that runs out: external validation, money, status, the approval of people they respect. These are legitimate motivators, but they are shallow fuel tanks. The work itself will ask more of you than any external reward can cover. Coltrane practiced because the saxophone called to him. Because there was something in the music he had not yet found, and he could not sleep until he found it. That kind of fuel doesn't run out. It compounds. And here is the underrated truth about obsession: it sharpens perception. When you spend 10,000 hours with one thing, you begin to see it the way others cannot. You notice the tiny variations. You see the patterns beneath the patterns. You develop what the ancient Greeks called phronesis, practical wisdom, the ability to read a situation and respond correctly, not because you're following a rule but because you've seen enough to know. The winner's mind is not scattered. It is focused. Not because they don't have curiosity. Coltrane had enormous curiosity. But because they have learned to point their curiosity like a lens focuses light. Where are you pointing yours? If your energy is spread across 17 things, it will produce 17 mediocre outcomes. Focus it, really focus it, with the intensity that makes other people uncomfortable, and you become capable of things that look, from the outside, like genius. They are not genius. They are the compound interest of directed obsession. The fourth thing winners understand: they build systems, not moods. Florence Nightingale is remembered as a nurse. That is like remembering Einstein as a teacher. She was a statistician, a systems designer, a political operator who understood that changing one sick person's life required changing the infrastructure that governed thousands of sick people's lives. When Nightingale arrived at Scutari Military Hospital during the Crimean War in 1854, she found a charnel house. More soldiers were dying of disease, dysentery, cholera, typhus, than of their battle wounds. The wards were ankle-deep in sewage. The ventilation was non-existent. The supply chain was broken. The record-keeping was a fiction. The standard response to this, for most people, would have been grief, followed by earnest, disorganized effort, followed by burnout. Nightingale's response was different. She brought clean linens. She organized supply procurement. She fought the military bureaucracy for months to get basic sanitation installed. And she built something that no nurse had ever built: a data visualization system. She invented what is now called the polar area diagram, a circular chart that made visible, for the first time, exactly how many soldiers were dying and from what causes. She brought this chart to Parliament, to the Queen, to anyone who had the power to change the system. Not because she wanted credit. She published much of her work anonymously and often deliberately kept her name off reports because she knew male politicians would listen more readily to male sources. She used the system's own biases against it. The mortality rate at Scutari dropped by 98% during her time there. What Nightingale understood, and what winners consistently demonstrate, is that emotion is a signal, not a strategy. When she walked into that hospital and saw what was happening, she did not override her feeling. She used it. She felt the outrage and the grief deeply enough that they became rocket fuel. But then she converted that fuel into systems, into processes, into structures that would keep working when she was sick, when she was tired, when she was in London instead of Scutari. Most people live inside their moods. They work hard when they feel motivated and coast when they don't. They are consistent only in their inconsistency. And so their output follows the sine wave of their emotional state, sometimes exceptional, often average, occasionally nothing at all. Winners build systems that run regardless of mood. Morning routines that don't require you to feel like it. Work schedules that aren't negotiated every day. Standards that are decided once and then executed automatically. This is not about being robotic. Nightingale was a deeply passionate woman. She wrote with fury and compassion and humor. But her passion was organized. It had rails. It could be sustained because it wasn't dependent on the perfect emotional state arriving every morning. The mood is the weather. The system is the architecture. The weather will change. The building stands regardless. Build the building. The fifth thing winners understand: they think in decades. Hanako, whose Western name was Emil Berliner, was not a man who expected fast results. But the figure we want to talk about here played an even longer game. Let's talk about Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus. Rome, 458 BC. The Roman army has been surrounded by the Equi tribe on Mount Algidus. The Senate is in crisis. They need a dictator, not the pejorative, the legal office, a single leader with supreme authority to resolve the emergency. They send messengers to a small farm across the Tiber River. They find Cincinnatus plowing his field. He is not wealthy. He is not powerful. He had held high office once before, years ago, and when his political fortunes fell, he simply went back to farming. No bitterness. No scheming. No waiting in the wings. He had found genuine peace in the work of his hands. He is told Rome needs him. He puts down the plow. He defeats the enemy. He rescues the army. He leads a triumph through Rome. And then, 16 days after being granted absolute power over the greatest city in the world, he resigns. He goes back to his farm. Back to the plow. He did it again, at 80 years old, when Rome called a second time. Cincinnatus is not remembered for his military victories, though they were real. He is remembered because he demonstrated a quality so rare it becomes mythological when it appears. He knew what he was for. He had no hunger for power beyond the purpose power served. He wanted Rome safe, and once Rome was safe, the power was irrelevant to him. Winners who last, not the ones who flare bright and burn out, but the ones who build something enduring, think this way. They know why they want what they want. They know what they will do with it once they have it. They are not chasing the feeling of achievement. They are building towards something specific, and they have thought far enough ahead that the immediate gratification of status or wealth or recognition is easy to forego. The person who thinks in decades behaves differently in every single moment. They do not need the win today because they can see the win coming in year 7. They are not reactive to short-term setbacks because their plan is not a short-term plan. They can be patient in the way that only people with genuine certainty can be patient, not passive, but deliberate. Most people overestimate what they can achieve in 1 year and catastrophically underestimate what they can achieve in 10. Cincinnatus plowed his field. He did what was in front of him. And when Rome called, he was ready, not because he had been scheming, but because he had been becoming. Quietly. Consistently. On an ordinary farm, doing ordinary work, building an extraordinary character. The man who is patient because he has no options is not patient. He is stuck. The man who is patient because he has a vision longer than anyone else's timeline, that man is building something no impatient person can ever touch. The sixth thing winners understand: invisibility is a strategy. Mary Seacole crossed the Atlantic twice to prove she was worth listening to. Born in Kingston, Jamaica, in 1805, Seacole learned nursing and herbal medicine from her mother and spent decades treating patients across the Caribbean and Central America: cholera, yellow fever, dysentery. By the time the Crimean War began, she had more field medicine experience than almost any European doctor on the continent. She applied to the British War Office to serve as a nurse. Rejected. She applied to multiple nursing organizations. Rejected. She applied again. Rejected again. The reasons were never stated explicitly, but they didn't need to be. She was a black woman in 1855, and the world she lived in had decided, long before she walked into any room, what she was and was not allowed to be. So she did something that required more courage than any battlefield could ask. She funded her own passage to Crimea. She built a structure she called the British Hotel near Balaclava, part inn, part store, part field hospital. She treated soldiers on the battlefield itself, carrying supplies under fire, moving between wounded men while artillery fell around her. The soldiers called her Mother Seacole. They wrote home about her. They said she was the bravest woman they'd ever seen. She did not need permission. She built the structure that made permission irrelevant. This is a winner's instinct that most people never develop because it requires swallowing something the ego fights with everything it has, the willingness to be ignored, underestimated, and dismissed, and to use that invisibility as operational cover. When the gatekeepers say no, the average person goes home. The winner asks, "What can I build that doesn't require this gate?" Cole didn't waste her energy raging at the War Office. She spent that energy building the British Hotel. And from the British Hotel, she did more than the people who rejected her would ever do. There is a version of strength that announces itself, that demands to be seen, that requires recognition before it acts. And there is another version that simply moves. That builds. That shows up at the battlefield while others are still writing letters of complaint. The second kind of strength is quieter. It does not need an audience. It does not require fair conditions. It is, in the end, the only kind that cannot be stopped, because it does not depend on anyone else's cooperation. Cole's story was suppressed for over a century. Buried. Forgotten. Rediscovered in the 1970s by researchers who found her biography, which had been a bestseller in 1857, gathering dust. The world eventually found her. Not because she demanded to be found. Because what she built was too real to be erased. Do work so real it cannot be erased. That is the standard. The 7th thing winners understand: they reframe failure as data. In the summer of 1944, in a field in Pennsylvania, a scientist sat down and did something that no one in her field believed was possible. Barbara McClintock had spent 20 years studying corn. Not the glamorous corner of biology. Not the frontier of discovery that attracted the brightest minds of her generation. Corn. Maize. Row after row of it, on a research farm in the heat, alone, with a microscope that required her to spend months preparing samples before she could examine them. What she found, what she could see under that microscope, was that genetic material was not fixed. That genes could move. That they jumped from one position on a chromosome to another in response to stress, in response to environmental conditions, in a dynamic process she called transposition. She presented this at a Cold Spring Harbor symposium in 1951. The room went cold. The scientists who heard her were confused and, in some cases, dismissive. The leading geneticists of the era had built careers on the assumption that genes were stable and fixed. What McClintock was describing threatened the foundation of the discipline. She stopped presenting her work publicly. Not because she stopped believing it. Because she had decided that the audience wasn't ready and that wasting time fighting an unwinnable argument was less valuable than continuing to discover things that were true. For over 30 years, she worked in near-total obscurity. She continued her research. She refined her understanding. She kept meticulous records of everything she found. In the late 1970s, molecular biologists discovered transposable elements in bacteria, independently confirming what McClintock had seen in corn in 1944. The field came back to her, somewhat sheepishly. In 1983, at the age of 81, she received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, the only unshared Nobel Prize in that category ever awarded to a woman. 32 years between the discovery and the recognition. What kept her going? What kept her going? Not applause. Not validation. Not even the hope that the prize was coming. She didn't think in those terms. She kept going because she found the work interesting. Because every failed experiment told her something. Because to her mind, what others called failure, a hypothesis disproven, a result that didn't fit the model, was just more data. Better data, sometimes, than success would have given her. This is the cognitive shift that separates people who build something lasting from people who try once and give up. The average mind categorizes outcomes into success and failure. The winner's mind categorizes outcomes into information. What worked? What didn't? Why? What does this tell me about the underlying reality that I didn't know before? Every failed pitch is market research. Every broken relationship is a mirror. Every project that didn't land is a lesson in what your audience actually needs versus what you thought they needed. Failure is only terminal if you treat it as a verdict rather than a variable. McClintock treated every anomaly, every data point that didn't fit the prevailing theory, as the most interesting thing she'd seen that week. Her mind was not organized around protecting her self-concept. It was organized around finding out. Protect your curiosity more than you protect your ego. The ego wants to be right. Curiosity wants to know. One of those drives leads to 32 years of quiet, devastating productivity. The other leads to a room full of people nodding at things they don't believe because they're afraid to look wrong. The eighth thing winners understand: standards are set before the moment, not in it. There is a reason Fred Rogers never raised his voice on television. Not because he was performing patience. Because he had made a decision, long before the cameras turned on, about the kind of presence he intended to be, and that decision did not get renegotiated based on how hard the day was, how exhausting the crew was, how many times a segment needed to be redone. Fred Rogers was not, by most external metrics, the obvious candidate to become one of the most influential figures in American children's television. He was not a performer by training, he was a musician and a Presbyterian minister. He did not have the kinetic energy of the television personalities of his era. He spoke slowly. He made extended eye contact with the camera. He addressed children as if they were full human beings capable of understanding complex emotional truths. When he testified before the United States Senate in 1969 to argue against cutting funding for public broadcasting, he faced a committee that was skeptical, rushed, and politically motivated to defund what they saw as a frivolous expense. Senator John Pastor, tough, impatient, openly hostile at the beginning of the hearing, had given Rogers 6 minutes. Rogers spoke for about 7. He did not raise his voice. He did not use rhetorical tricks. He simply read a piece of music he had written, a song about what it feels like to be angry, to feel things children are told not to feel, and when he finished, Senator Pastor said, quote, "I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million. That moment was not improvised. That moment was the result of decades of consistent standard setting. Rogers had decided who he was going to be in every room he entered, and he did not renegotiate that based on how hard the room was. Most people set their standards in the moment. They decide how hard they'll work based on how they feel when they wake up. They decide how they'll treat someone based on how that person treated them first. They decide what kind of person they'll be based on what the situation seems to call for. This is not a standard. This is a reaction. A standard is decided in advance, in a moment of clarity, when you are not under pressure. It is the thing you hold to because you decided it, not because the conditions support it. The standard is precisely what you hold to when the conditions don't support it. Rogers went into the Senate chamber prepared to be dismissed. He had no guarantee Pastor would listen. He held his standard anyway. Not because it was guaranteed to work. Because it was who he had decided to be. This is the unsexy truth about character. It is not revealed in moments of ease. It is built, incrementally, through the choices you make when no one is watching and there is no immediate reward. And then, when the Senate chamber moment arrives, when everything is on the line and the person across from you has the power to destroy what you've built, your character shows up automatically. Because it's been rehearsed 10,000 times in ordinary rooms. Decide now who you are going to be in the hard moments. Write it down if you have to. And then hold to it the way a compass holds to north, not because it's easy, but because the direction matters more than the discomfort. The ninth thing winners understand: the finish is where most people quit. In the summer of 1912, at the Olympic Games in Stockholm, a Finnish runner named Hannes Kalamainen competed in the 5,000-meter race against the greatest long-distance runners in the world. He was 22 years old. He was running against Jean Bouin of France, who had set world records and was considered the favorite. Bouin led the race. For most of it, Kalamainen could not get past him. They ran shoulder to shoulder for lap after lap in the kind of heat that breaks people. And then, in the last 50 meters, not the last lap, not the last 200 meters, the last 50, Kalamainen found something. He won by 1/10 of a second, setting a world record. What Kalamainen had that Bouin didn't, what he had trained specifically, deliberately, was a finish. Not a sprint, exactly. A controlled acceleration that he had rehearsed until it was automatic. He had run the last 50 meters of races in training when he was exhausted. When his form was breaking down and his lungs were burning. He had trained the finish after the point of pain, so that when the real race arrived and the real pain hit, he knew what it felt like to keep going through it. This is the final, defining quality of the winner's mind. They do not allow themselves to mentally finish before the work is done. Most people who fail at large things do not fail at the beginning. They fail at the beginning of the end. When the project is 80% done and the remaining 20% is the hardest part. When the business is almost viable and the next step requires something they've never done. When the relationship is worth fighting for but the conversation required is terrifying. The beginning is energized by novelty. The middle is sustained by momentum. The end requires something different, a kind of gritted, unglamorous determination that doesn't look inspiring and doesn't feel good but is, in fact, the most important thing. Kalamein knew this. He did not conserve himself for the finish. He prepared himself for it. He trained in conditions that matched the moment when his body would scream to stop, so that when that moment arrived in competition, he had a practice response. This is where I go faster. You need to identify, right now, where your finish line is. Not the final goal. The part just before the final goal, the 50 meters before the tape, where every signal in your body will tell you to ease up. And you need to make a decision, in advance, in a moment of clarity and calm, that you will not ease up there. Not because it won't hurt. It will. Not because it will feel triumphant. It won't, not yet. But because the person who holds through the finish, who finds something in the last 50 meters when everyone around them is fading, that person wins races. Builds companies. Changes fields. Finishes manuscripts. Transforms lives. The whole race is preparation for the last 50 meters. Run them like you trained them. This is the mind of a winner. Let's come back to them. Semmelweis, who saw the truth before the world was ready, and from whom we learned to see reality without flinching. Shackleton, standing on the ice with 27 lives in his hands, who teaches us that pressure is not a threat but a fuel. Coltrane, practicing through bleeding lips in a room where no one was watching, who shows us what happens when obsession is pointed at the right target. Nightingale, building systems where others built sympathy, who reminds us that passion organized is more powerful than passion alone. Cincinnatus, walking back to his plow when he could have kept the throne, who teaches us what it means to think in decades rather than moments. C. Cole, denied at every official door and building her own entrance, who shows us that permission is optional when your will is strong enough. McClintock, 32 years of quiet certainty, who teaches us that failure is only data, and curiosity outlasts every obstacle. Rogers, speaking slowly in a room that wanted to dismiss him, who reminds us that standards set in advance are the only standards that hold. Kalamein, finding speed in the last 50 meters when his body screamed to stop, who shows us that the finish is where the winner reveals themselves. 9 people. 9 different centuries, countries, fields. 1 mind. The mind that does not need the world to be fair. That does not require conditions to be perfect. That does not wait for permission or applause or the right moment, or a favorable wind. The mind that looks at the obstacle and says, "Good. This is where I find out what I'm made of." You were not built for comfort. You were built for this. Subscribe to Inner Steel for more. Because the journey to becoming someone the world cannot ignore starts with a single decision to think differently, and that decision starts right now. Inner Steel, forged in stillness. Sharpened by truth.